The blizzard hit Cripple Creek, Colorado, with such ferocity that Tabitha Everett couldn't see 3 feet in front of her face as she stumbled down the frozen Main Street, her threadbare coat doing nothing to protect her from the bitter wind that cut through to her bones. She had arrived in town 3 days ago with exactly 47 cents in her pocket and nowhere to go, having fled her stepfather's ranch in Kansas after he tried to sell her to a traveling merchant twice her age. The journey west had been harder than she'd anticipated, and now, at 22 years old, she found herself completely alone in a mining town where nobody knew her name and nobody seemed to care whether she lived or died. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, and she could barely feel her feet as they dragged through the mounting snowdrifts. The sun had set already, though it was only 4 in the afternoon, the December darkness coming early and unforgiving. Tabitha's vision blurred as she tried to focus on the buildings around her, searching desperately for somewhere to take shelter. Most of the establishments were closed tight against the storm, their windows dark and uninviting. She had tried the boarding house earlier, but the proprietor had taken one look at her dirty traveling clothes and empty pockets before slamming the door in her face. The saloon wouldn't let her in without money for a drink, and the general store owner had chased her out when she'd lingered too long by the wood stove. Her legs finally gave out near the edge of town, and she collapsed against a fence post, too exhausted and cold to go any further. This was it, she thought distantly. She was going to die here in the snow, alone and forgotten, just another nameless drifter who'd come west looking for something better and found only hardship instead. Her eyes drifted closed as the snow continued to fall, covering her dark hair with white powder. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a deep voice cut through the howling wind. "Madam, madam, you cannot stay out here." Tabitha forced her eyes open and saw a tall figure standing over her, backlit by a lantern he carried. She couldn't make out his features, but she could see the broad shoulders and the outline of a cowboy hat covered in snow. "Go away," she mumbled, her tongue feeling thick and clumsy in her mouth. "Just let me be." "Like hell I will," the man said, and before she could protest, he'd set down his lantern and scooped her up into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. "You will freeze to death out here, and I will not have that on my conscience." Tabitha wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she was fine, but the warmth radiating from his body was too tempting to resist. She found herself leaning into his chest as he carried her through the snow, his long strides eating up the distance with practiced ease. Through her half-frozen state, she registered that he smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else that was distinctly masculine. The cowboy kicked open a door and carried her into a small cabin that was blessedly warm. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and Tabitha whimpered at the promise of heat. He set her down carefully on a chair near the fire and immediately began working at the buttons of her wet coat. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes before you catch your death," he said, his voice all business. Tabitha's survival instinct finally kicked in and she pushed weakly at his hands. "Do not touch me." The man stepped back immediately, raising his hands. "I apologize. I should have explained. I am not trying to take advantage. But your clothes are soaked through, and if you do not get warm soon, you are going to lose fingers and toes to frostbite, if not worse. I will turn around while you change. There is a spare shirt and some long underwear in the trunk by the bed. They will be too big, but they are dry and warm." He turned his back to her without waiting for a response, moving to the small kitchen area where he began working at something Tabitha couldn't see. She looked down at her hands and saw that her fingers were an alarming shade of white. Fear gave her the motivation to move, and she struggled out of her wet coat and dress with clumsy, uncooperative hands. The dry clothes he'd mentioned were where he'd said they'd be, and she pulled them on gratefully, not caring that the shirt hung down to her knees and she had to roll the underwear waistband several times to keep them up. "I am decent," she said quietly, her teeth still chattering. The cowboy turned around, and Tabitha got her first good look at her rescuer. He was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes that were such a pale blue they were almost gray. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with strong features and a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He was handsome in a rugged sort of way, though Tabitha tried not to think about that too much. He approached with a thick blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders before pressing a steaming mug into her hands. "Drink this. It is just hot tea with honey, but it will help warm you from the inside." Tabitha took a sip and nearly moaned at the sensation of the hot liquid sliding down her throat. She wrapped both hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. "What in God's name were you doing out in that storm?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her. His tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely puzzled. "I did not have anywhere else to go," Tabitha admitted, staring down into her tea. "I have been sleeping in the livery stable for the past 2 nights, but the owner found me this morning and ran me out. I was looking for somewhere else when the storm got bad." The cowboy was quiet for a long moment. "You are new to Cripple Creek." It wasn't a question, but Tabitha nodded anyway. "I arrived 3 days ago from Kansas. I thought maybe I could find work here, but everyone I've talked to says they are not hiring women without references, and I do not have any." "Where is your family?" "Dead, or might as well be," Tabitha said flatly. "My mother died when I was 15. My father remarried a year later and then died himself 2 years after that. My stepfather kept me on at the ranch to cook and clean, but last month he tried to sell me off to settle a debt, so I left." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "He tried to sell you?" "Like I was livestock," Tabitha confirmed, taking another sip of tea. "I took what little money I had saved and left in the middle of the night. I thought if I could get far enough away, I could start over somewhere new. But I spent almost everything I had on train fare and food, and now I am here with no money, no job, and nowhere to stay. I suppose that makes me quite pathetic." "It makes you brave," the cowboy corrected. "Not many women would have the courage to strike out on their own like that. Most would have accepted whatever fate was handed to them." Tabitha looked up at him in surprise, not sure what to make of that. "I am not brave. I was just desperate. Sometimes those two things are the same." He stood and moved to the fire, adding another log before turning back to her. "I am Quincy Callahan, by the way. I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles outside of town. I came into Cripple Creek to pick up supplies before the storm hit, but it got bad faster than expected. This cabin belongs to a friend who is spending the winter down in Denver. He lets me use it when I need to stay in town." "Tabitha Everett," she replied. "And I truly do appreciate you helping me, Mr. Callahan. Once the storm passes, I will be out of your way." "And go where exactly?" Quincy asked, raising an eyebrow. "You said yourself you have no money and nowhere to stay." Tabitha didn't have an answer for that. She'd been trying not to think about what came next, focusing only on surviving the immediate moment. "I will figure something out. I always do." Quincy studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes assessing. "How do you feel about hard work?" "I am not afraid of it," Tabitha said cautiously, not sure where this was going. "I need help at my ranch. My previous cook quit a month ago to go live with her daughter in California, and I have been managing on my own since then. But with winter setting in, I need someone who can handle the household duties. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. The work is not easy, but it is honest." Tabitha stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You are offering me a job, but you do not even know me. I know you had the courage to run away from a bad situation. I know you are willing to sleep in a barn rather than give up. And I know that you were ready to die in that snowstorm rather than beg for help." Quincy shrugged. "That tells me more about your character than any reference letter could. How do you know I am not a thief, or that I will not rob you blind the first chance I get?" Tabitha felt compelled to point out, even though the last thing she wanted was to talk him out of giving her this opportunity. "Are you planning to rob me blind?" "No." "Then I suppose we do not have a problem." Quincy moved back to the kitchen area and began pulling out supplies. "You must be hungry. When was the last time you ate?" Tabitha had to think about it. "Yesterday morning, I had some bread I'd saved." She saw his shoulders tense, but when he turned around, his expression was carefully neutral. "I will make us some dinner. We are stuck here until the storm passes anyway, which probably will not be until tomorrow morning at the earliest. You should rest. There are extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold." "I can help," Tabitha offered, starting to rise. "You can barely stand," Quincy said firmly. "Sit down and drink your tea. There will be plenty of time for you to work once we get to the ranch." Tabitha wanted to argue, but exhaustion was catching up with her now that she was warm and safe. She settled back into the chair and sipped her tea, watching as Quincy moved around the small kitchen with easy efficiency. He was different from most of the men she'd known, she realized. Her father had been kind but distant, more interested in his cattle than his family. Her stepfather had been cruel and calculating. The men she'd encountered on her journey west had either ignored her completely or looked at her with intentions that made her skin crawl. But Quincy was treating her with a matter-of-fact kindness that didn't seem to expect anything in return. He'd rescued her from the storm, offered her a job, and was now cooking her dinner, all without asking for so much as a thank you. It made her suspicious, honestly. Nobody did something for nothing in her experience. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked abruptly. Quincy glanced over his shoulder. "Does there have to be an ulterior motive?" "In my experience, there usually is." He was quiet for a moment, focusing on whatever he was cooking. The smell of frying bacon filled the cabin, making Tabitha's stomach growl audibly. Finally, he said, "My mother died when I was young. My father raised me and my two sisters on his own. When I was 17, my older sister Margaret found herself in a bad situation. The man she'd been courting turned out to be married and wanted nothing to do with her or the baby she was carrying. Our father was, not understanding, he threw her out." Tabitha's heart clenched. "What happened to her?" "I do not know," Quincy admitted, his voice tight. "I tried to find her, but she disappeared. That was 10 years ago, and I have not seen or heard from her since. So when I see a woman alone and in trouble, I think about Margaret. I think about how I hope someone showed her kindness when she needed it most. Maybe if enough of us look out for each other, it balances out the cruelty in the world." "That is a nice thought," Tabitha said softly. "My younger sister Emily lives in town with her husband. She tells me I am too idealistic." Quincy carried over 2 plates loaded with bacon, beans, and thick slices of bread. "But I figure idealism never hurt anyone." They ate in companionable silence, and Tabitha had to force herself to eat slowly rather than wolfing down the food like she wanted to. It was the best meal she'd had in weeks, even though it was simple fare. When she'd finished every last bite, she looked up to find Quincy watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I promise I will work hard to earn my keep at your ranch." "I am sure you will," Quincy replied, "but for tonight, just rest. You have been through an ordeal." The storm raged outside throughout the night, the wind howling like a living thing. Quincy insisted Tabitha take the bed while he made himself comfortable in the chair by the fire. She protested, but he'd been immovable on the subject, and she was too tired to argue for long. She fell asleep almost immediately, warm and fed and safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. When she woke the next morning, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the window, and the sound of the storm had finally ceased. Quincy was already up, standing by the stove and making coffee. He looked over when he heard her stirring. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" Tabitha took stock of herself. Her fingers and toes tingled painfully, but she could move them all, which she took as a good sign. Her body ached from the hard travel and exposure, but it was nothing that wouldn't heal. "Sore but alive, thanks to you. The storm passed about an hour ago. If you are up for it, we can head out to the ranch after breakfast." He poured her a cup of coffee and brought it over. "I should warn you, it is fairly isolated. My nearest neighbor is 2 miles away. If you are going to get lonely easily, you might want to reconsider." "I think I will manage," Tabitha said dryly. "Isolation sounds rather peaceful after everything I have been through lately." The ranch turned out to be exactly what Quincy had described: isolated but beautiful in its own stark way. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from logs and stone, positioned in a valley with mountains rising up on 3 sides. There was a large barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket that sparkled in the morning sun. "I have 6 ranch hands who work for me," Quincy explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "They live in the bunkhouse and usually take their meals there, but a few times a week I have them up to the main house for dinner. I should also tell you that 2 of them are Apache. Their names are Yellow Hawk and Swift River. I do not tolerate any prejudice on my land. If that is going to be a problem for you, tell me now." "It is not a problem," Tabitha assured him. She'd met very few native people in her life, but her mother had always taught her that respect was earned through character, not determined by race or background. The inside of the house was surprisingly neat for a bachelor establishment. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with a cast iron stove, a dining area, and a comfortable sitting room. Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms, one of which Quincy showed her to. "This was my mother's sewing room, but I moved a bed in here for the last cook. You can arrange it however you like. The door has a lock, and you are the only one with a key." He handed her a small brass key. "I want you to feel safe here, Tabitha. My room is down the hall, and the other 2 rooms are empty. The ranch hands know better than to come into the house without permission." Tabitha looked around the small room with its simple furnishings and single window overlooking the mountains. It was more than she'd had in years, and she felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "It is perfect." Over the next few weeks, Tabitha settled into a routine at the ranch. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, feeding Quincy and whichever ranch hands came up to the house. Then she spent the day cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and doing the hundreds of small tasks that kept a household running. It was hard work, just as Quincy had warned, but it was honest work, and for the first time in a long time, Tabitha felt like she had a purpose. Quincy turned out to be an excellent employer. He was fair and respectful, never raising his voice or making unreasonable demands. He often worked alongside his men, whether it was mending fences, feeding cattle, or breaking ice in the water troughs. Tabitha found herself watching him sometimes as he worked, admiring the easy strength in his movements and the way he treated everyone with the same steady courtesy. She got to know the ranch hands too. Yellow Hawk was older, probably in his 50s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. Swift River was younger, perhaps close to Tabitha's own age, with quick hands and a quicker smile. The other 4 ranch hands were a mix: 2 older men who'd been working cattle their whole lives, and 2 younger cowboys who were still learning the trade. What surprised Tabitha most was how easily she was accepted. The men treated her with respect, always removing their hats when she brought out meals, thanking her for the food, and offering to help if they saw her struggling with something heavy. It was a far cry from the hostile reception she'd received in town, and she found herself slowly beginning to relax. One evening in early January, a month after Tabitha had arrived, she was washing dishes when Quincy came in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots. "There is another storm moving in," he announced. "Probably will hit sometime tonight. I am going to have the men bring some of the cattle closer to the barn so we do not lose any." "You need me to do anything?" Tabitha asked. "Just make sure there is plenty of hot coffee ready. It is going to be a long night." He paused, then added, "You have been doing an excellent job, by the way. I meant to tell you that sooner." Tabitha felt warmth that had nothing to do with the stove spread through her chest. "Thank you. I am grateful for the opportunity you gave me." "I am the grateful one. I had forgotten how nice it is to have a proper home-cooked meal every day." He gave her a small smile that transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger. "My biscuits were starting to resemble rocks." Tabitha laughed, surprising herself. She hadn't laughed much in recent years, but somehow Quincy had a way of drawing it out of her. "I am happy to spare everyone from that particular hardship. The storm that hit that night was fierce, but not as bad as the one that had nearly killed her a month earlier." Tabitha stayed up late making coffee and sandwiches for the men as they came in and out, checking on the cattle and making sure everything was secure. Quincy was the last one to come in, well past midnight, his face red from the cold and his clothes covered in snow. "Everyone is accounted for," he reported, gratefully accepting the hot coffee she pressed into his hands. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," Tabitha assured him, "though I admit these storms still make me nervous. After what you went through, I imagine they would." Quincy studied her over the rim of his mug. "Do you want to talk about it? That night, I mean." Tabitha considered deflecting, but there was something about the quiet darkness of the kitchen and Quincy's steady presence that made her want to open up. "I really thought I was going to die. And the strangest part was that I almost felt relieved, like death would be easier than continuing to struggle. But you did not give up," Quincy pointed out gently, "only because you did not let me." Tabitha wrapped her arms around herself. "You saved my life, Quincy. I have not properly thanked you for that. You do not need to thank me. I only did what anyone decent would have done." "But most people are not decent," Tabitha countered. "I learned that the hard way. You are different from most men I have known. You are kind without expecting anything in return. That is a rare quality." Quincy looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just try to treat people the way I would want to be treated. It is not that complicated. Maybe it should not be, but somehow it is." Tabitha hesitated, then asked, "Did you ever find out what happened to your sister, Margaret?" "No," Quincy said quietly. "I have looked, but it is like she vanished. Sometimes I wonder if she changed her name, started over somewhere new where nobody knew her story. I hope she is happy wherever she is. I hope she found someone who treated her with kindness." "I am sure she did," Tabitha said, though she wasn't sure at all. The world was often unkind to women in difficult situations, but she didn't want to make Quincy's pain worse by pointing that out. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Finally, Quincy stood and stretched. "I should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day. You should rest too." "I will," Tabitha promised. "Good night, Quincy." "Good night, Tabitha." As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Tabitha found herself thinking more and more about her employer. It wasn't just gratitude she felt anymore, though that was certainly part of it. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the rare smile he would give her when she said something that amused him, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was thinking hard about something. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just natural affection for someone who had shown her kindness. But then she would catch herself watching him as he worked, noticing the play of muscles under his shirt, the strong line of his jaw, the gentle way he handled even the most stubborn animals. She would find herself listening for his footsteps, her heart beating a little faster when he walked into a room. It was dangerous, she knew. She was his employee, dependent on him for her livelihood and shelter. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a man who probably saw her as nothing more than a good cook and housekeeper. So she tried to push the feelings down, to maintain the professional distance that was appropriate between an employer and employee. It didn't help that Quincy seemed to be warming to her as well. He sought out her company more often, asking her opinion on things, sharing stories from his past. He'd started teaching her to ride, saying that living on a ranch meant she needed to know how to handle a horse. Those lessons were torture in the sweetest way, with Quincy standing close behind her, his hands guiding hers on the reins, his voice low and patient in her ear. One afternoon in late March, Tabitha was hanging laundry when she heard a horse approaching at a gallop. She turned to see a young woman with dark hair riding up to the house, her face flushed and urgent. "Is Quincy here?" the woman demanded, barely waiting for her horse to stop before she was sliding off. "He is out checking the fence line in the north pasture," Tabitha replied. "Can I help you with something? I am Tabitha, the housekeeper." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I am Emily, Quincy's sister. I need to speak with him right away. It is urgent." "I can send one of the ranch hands to fetch him," Tabitha offered. "Please come inside and wait." "You look chilled." Emily followed her into the kitchen, accepting the coffee Tabitha quickly prepared. Up close, Tabitha could see the family resemblance. Emily had the same pale blue eyes as her brother, though her features were more delicate. "I apologize for being so abrupt," Emily said after taking a sip. "I have just received some news and Quincy needs to hear it immediately." Before Tabitha could respond, they heard boots on the porch, and Quincy came striding in, Swift River right behind him. He must have been closer than Tabitha thought. "Emily, what is wrong?" Quincy's voice was tight with concern. Emily set down her coffee cup, her hands shaking slightly. "I found Margaret." The silence that followed was deafening. Quincy went completely still, his face draining of color. "What?" "I found Margaret," Emily repeated. "Or rather, she found me. She showed up at my house 2 days ago. Quincy, she has been living in Denver this whole time. She has a daughter who is 9 years old. She named her Lily." Quincy sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. Is she all right?" "She is alive and healthy, if that is what you are asking. But she has been working as a seamstress to support herself and Lily. It has not been easy for her." Emily reached out and grabbed her brother's hand. "She wants to see you." "She was afraid you would not want to see her, that you would judge her the way Father did. I told her she was being ridiculous, but she would not believe me. She needs to hear it from you." "Of course I want to see her," Quincy said fiercely. "She is my sister. I have spent 10 years looking for her." "Then come back to town with me now," Emily urged. "She is staying with me and Robert. She is so nervous, Quincy. She needs to know she is not alone anymore." Quincy stood, already moving toward the door, then stopped and turned back to Tabitha. "I am sorry to leave you like this, but I have to go." "Of course you do," Tabitha said warmly. "Family comes first. Do not worry about anything here. I will manage." Swift River, you are in charge until I get back, Quincy said. It might be a few days. Take all the time you need, Tabitha insisted. And Quincy, I am happy for you. I hope the reunion goes well. He gave her a look that was full of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. Then he and Emily were gone, riding off toward town at a pace that would get them there before nightfall. Tabitha went back to her work, but her mind kept drifting to Quincy. She hoped his sister would accept his forgiveness, hoped that maybe the family could begin to heal from the damage their father had done. She thought about what it must have cost Margaret to reach out after 10 years, the courage it took to face possible rejection from the brother she'd left behind. 3 days passed before Quincy returned. Tabitha was kneading bread dough when she heard his horse, and she wiped her hands on her apron before stepping out onto the porch. He looked exhausted but lighter somehow, like a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. How did it go? She asked as he dismounted. It was hard, Quincy admitted, walking up the porch steps. We both cried a lot, but it was good too. She told me everything that happened after she left. It was not easy for her, raising a child alone, dealing with people's judgment, but she survived, and so did Lily. I am glad she found you again, Tabitha said sincerely. So am I. Quincy ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Tabitha had learned meant he was processing something difficult. I invited them to come live here at the ranch. There is plenty of room, and Lily should have space to grow up, not be confined to a small apartment in the city. Margaret is thinking about it. That would be wonderful, Tabitha said. I would be happy to help with Lily if they do come. Quincy's eyes met hers, and there was something warm in his gaze that made her breath catch. You are remarkable, you know that. Most people in your position would be worried about their job security if I brought family to live here. But your first thought is about helping. Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks. I have known what it is like to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. If I can help your sister avoid that feeling, then I want to. See? Remarkable. Quincy took a step closer. Tabitha, these past few months having you here, it has made me realize how empty this house was before. You have made it feel like a home again. Her heart was racing now. Quincy, I know this is probably not appropriate, he continued, his voice low. I am your employer, and the last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable or to make you feel obligated. But I need you to know that I have developed feelings for you, strong feelings. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. You are brave and kind and beautiful, and I am falling in love with you. Tabitha couldn't breathe. She'd hoped in her secret heart, but she'd never really believed he could feel the same way. You are falling in love with me. I am, Quincy confirmed. But if you do not feel the same, I will respect that. We can go on just as we have been, and I will never mention it again. Your place here is secure no matter what you say. I need you to know that. Quincy Callahan, Tabitha said, her voice shaking, you are the most frustrating man I have ever met. He looked taken aback. I am. Yes, because I have been falling in love with you for weeks now, and I have been trying so hard to hide it, trying to convince myself it was just gratitude or admiration or anything other than what it actually is. She stepped closer to him. I love you. I love your kindness and your integrity and the way you treat everyone with respect. I love that you never stopped looking for your sister. I love how gentle you are with the animals and how you work just as hard as any of your men. I love you, and I have been terrified that you would never see me as anything more than your housekeeper. The smile that spread across Quincy's face was like the sun coming out. You love me. I do, Tabitha confirmed. Very much. Quincy closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. May I kiss you, please? Tabitha whispered. The kiss was everything she dreamed of and more. His lips were soft but firm, and he kissed her like she was precious, like she was something to be cherished. Tabitha's hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, and she felt him smile against her mouth. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long." "I have wanted you to," Tabitha admitted. "Though I was trying very hard not to want you to." "We are both terrible at hiding our feelings, apparently," Quincy said with a laugh. "Swift River told me 2 weeks ago that I was being obvious about my feelings for you. I denied it at the time, but he was right." "Yellow Hawk told me something similar," Tabitha said, "though he was more subtle about it. He said I looked at you the way his wife used to look at him." "Smart man," Quincy said. He kissed her again, softer this time. "So what do we do now?" "I suppose that depends on what you want," Tabitha said carefully. "I know you said you have feelings for me, but what does that mean exactly?" Quincy pulled back enough to look her in the eyes. "It means I want you to be more than my housekeeper. I want to court you properly, if you will let me. I want to take you into town for dinner, to introduce you to people as the woman I am courting. And eventually, if you will have me, I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife and my partner and the mother of my children someday. I know it is probably too soon to be talking about marriage, but I believe in being honest about my intentions." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes. "No one has ever wanted to marry me before." "Then every man you have ever known has been a fool," Quincy said firmly. "You are extraordinary, Tabitha Everett, and I would be honored if you would let me court you." "Yes," Tabitha said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I would like that very much." They stood on the porch holding each other as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tabitha thought about how different her life was now compared to just 5 months ago. Then, she'd been alone and desperate, willing to die in a snowstorm rather than face another day of uncertainty. Now, she was being held by a man who loved her, standing on land that felt like home, with a future stretching out before her that was full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked softly. "About how lucky I am that you found me in that storm," Tabitha said. "About how my life changed completely in the span of a single night." "I was the lucky one," Quincy countered. "I found something that night that I did not even know I was looking for." Over the next few months, Quincy courted Tabitha with old-fashioned dedication. He took her into town for dinners and dances, bought her small gifts like ribbons and sweets, and spent his evenings sitting with her on the porch talking about everything and nothing. He was never pushy or demanding, always respectful of her boundaries, but there was no mistaking the depth of his feelings. Margaret and Lily did decide to move to the ranch in late April. Margaret was a quiet woman who carried herself with a sort of weary dignity. She was clearly nervous about being judged, but Tabitha went out of her way to make her feel welcome. The two women became fast friends, bonding over their shared experiences of having to survive in a world that was often unkind to women without male protection. Lily was a bright, curious child who reminded Tabitha of what she might have been like before life had hardened her. The girl was initially shy, but she quickly warmed up to everyone at the ranch, especially the horses. Quincy was wonderful with her, patient and kind, and watching him with his niece made Tabitha's heart swell. One evening in June, Quincy asked Tabitha to go for a ride with him. They rode up into the mountains to a small meadow filled with wildflowers, the peaks rising majestically around them. He helped her dismount and then led her to a flat rock that overlooked the valley. "I used to come here a lot after my mother died," Quincy said, settling beside her. "It is peaceful up here, makes you feel small in a good way, like your problems are not as insurmountable as they seem." "It is beautiful," Tabitha agreed, looking out at the view. "Thank you for sharing this place with me." "Tabitha," Quincy said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him. He was holding a small velvet box, and her heart started to race. "We have known each other for 6 months now. I know some people might say that is not long enough, that we should wait longer before making any big decisions. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "I love you, Tabitha. You are my best friend and my partner. You make me want to be a better man. You have brought life and warmth back to my home and to my heart. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Tabitha was crying now, but they were happy tears. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Quincy's hands shook slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he was kissing her, and Tabitha kissed him back with all the love and joy she felt. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "I cannot believe this is real," Tabitha said, looking down at the ring on her finger. "Sometimes I still think I am going to wake up and discover I am still freezing to death in that snowstorm, and this has all been a dream." "It is real," Quincy assured her. "You are here, you are mine, and I am never letting you go." They were married in July in a simple ceremony at the small church in Cripple Creek. Emily and her husband Robert were there, along with Margaret and Lily, all the ranch hands and a few friends Tabitha had made in town. She wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Lily had picked that morning. As Tabitha walked down the aisle toward Quincy, who was waiting for her with love shining in his eyes, she thought about how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been trapped in a situation with no way out, convinced that her life would never amount to anything. Now she was marrying a good man who loved her, surrounded by people who had become her family, about to start a new chapter that was full of promise. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Tabitha barely heard the words. She was too focused on Quincy, on the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When it came time to say their vows, Quincy's voice was steady and sure. "I, Quincy Callahan, take you, Tabitha Everett, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part." Tabitha's voice shook with emotion as she repeated the words back to him. "I, Tabitha Everett, take you, Quincy Callahan, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part." "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced, and Quincy didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Tabitha into his arms and kissed her to the cheers and applause of their guests. The celebration afterward was small but joyful. The ranch hands had set up tables outside, and Margaret and Emily had prepared a feast. There was music and dancing, and Tabitha felt like she was floating as Quincy spun her around the makeshift dance floor. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Tabitha replied honestly. "Thank you for finding me in that storm. Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would." "You do not need to keep thanking me," Quincy said, though his eyes were soft. "I am the one who should be grateful. You saved me too, you know. I was just going through the motions before you came along. You reminded me what it means to really live." As the sun set and the first stars began to appear, Quincy and Tabitha slipped away from the celebration and rode back to the ranch. They'd given Margaret and Lily the main house for the night, and instead headed to a small line shack on the far edge of the property that they'd fixed up for their wedding night. Inside, someone, probably Emily, had left candles burning and flowers on the small table. It was simple but romantic, and Tabitha felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Quincy seemed to sense her anxiety because he took her hands gently. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he said. "We have all the time in the world." "I want to," Tabitha said. "I am just nervous. I have never. That is, I do not have experience with this." "Neither do I," Quincy admitted, and Tabitha looked at him in surprise. "I always wanted my first time to be with someone I loved. I guess I have been waiting for you." That confession melted the last of Tabitha's nervousness. She reached up and kissed him, putting everything she felt into it. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," Quincy replied. "So much." They took their time learning each other, gentle and patient and full of love. It was awkward at times, fumbling and uncertain, but it was also perfect because they were together. When Tabitha finally fell asleep in Quincy's arms, she felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. The next morning, they rode back to the main house to find Margaret had prepared a huge breakfast. Lily was chattering excitedly about the wedding, and the ranch hands were already back at work, though they all made sure to congratulate the newlyweds. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Tabitha was no longer just the housekeeper but the lady of the house, though she still insisted on doing most of the cooking because she enjoyed it. She and Quincy worked together to make the ranch prosper, and she found that she loved being involved in the decisions about what cattle to buy, which pastures to use, how to manage their resources. Margaret proved to be invaluable as well. She was excellent with numbers and took over managing the ranch's books, which freed up time for both Quincy and Tabitha. Lily started attending the school in town, riding in with Emily's children every day. A year after their wedding, Tabitha realized her monthly bleeding was late. She waited another week, wanting to be sure before she said anything to Quincy. When there was no doubt, she waited for the perfect moment to tell him. That moment came on a cool evening in September. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their custom. Quincy had his arm around her and she was leaning into his warmth. "Quincy," she said, her heart racing, "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" he asked, looking down at her with concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," Tabitha assured him. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." Quincy went very still. We are," Tabitha confirmed. "I think I am about 2 months along. The baby should come sometime in April." The look of pure joy that spread across Quincy's face was something Tabitha would remember for the rest of her life. He let out a whoop of happiness and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down carefully. "Sorry, I should not be so rough with you," he said, looking worried. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Tabitha laughed. "You can still hug me." "We are going to have a baby," Quincy repeated as if he couldn't quite believe it. "You are going to be a mother. I am going to be a father." "You are going to be an excellent father," Tabitha told him. "I have seen how you are with Lily. Our child is going to be very lucky." That night, Quincy was extra gentle with her, constantly asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. Tabitha found it endearing even as she told him he was being ridiculous. The pregnancy was not easy. Tabitha was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep anything down. Margaret was wonderful, making her special teas and bland foods that she could tolerate. Quincy hovered constantly, driving her a little crazy with his concern, but also making her feel incredibly loved. As her belly grew, Tabitha found herself having to give up more and more of her usual tasks. She could no longer ride, which was frustrating, and by her 8th month, she was too big to comfortably cook standing at the stove for hours. Margaret took over most of the cooking, insisting that Tabitha needed to rest. "I feel useless," Tabitha complained one afternoon as she sat in the kitchen watching Margaret make bread. "You are growing a human being," Margaret said dryly. "That is hardly useless. You know what I mean." I am supposed to be running this household, and instead, I am sitting here like a lumpy potato." "A beautiful lumpy potato," Quincy said, coming in from the barn. He kissed the top of her head. "And you are not useless. You are doing the most important job there is." "That is easy for you to say," Tabitha grumbled, but she was smiling. When she went into labor on a warm April evening, she was almost relieved. She was ready to meet this baby and to have her body back to herself. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. The doctor from town had come to help, along with Emily, who had experience with childbirth from her own 2 children. Quincy stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when Tabitha was cursing him for getting her pregnant in the first place. When their son finally arrived just after dawn, red-faced and screaming, Tabitha was exhausted but overwhelmed with love. "He is perfect," Quincy said, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "Tabitha, he is perfect." "He is," Tabitha agreed, though she could barely keep her eyes open. "What should we name him?" They discussed names but hadn't settled on anything. Quincy looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now looking around with unfocused eyes. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After your father." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes. Her father had been a good man, even if he'd made the mistake of marrying poorly after her mother died. "Thomas Callahan, I like it." Thomas was a happy baby who only cried when he was hungry or needed changing. He had Quincy's pale blue eyes and Tabitha's dark hair, and everyone who saw him declared him to be the most beautiful baby they'd ever seen. Quincy was completely smitten, often spending hours just watching his son sleep. "I never knew I could love anyone this much," he said one night as they were putting Thomas to bed in the cradle Quincy had built. "I thought what I felt for you was as much love as a person could hold, but then he came along, and somehow my heart just expanded." "I know what you mean," Tabitha said softly. She looked at her husband and son and felt such contentment that it almost scared her. "Sometimes I am afraid I am going to wake up and discover this was all a dream." "It is real," Quincy said, pulling her close. "This is our life. We made this together." As Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. They added more cattle, hired 2 more ranch hands, and expanded the barn. Margaret met a widower in town, a gentle man who owned the hardware store, and after a proper courtship, they married and moved into town, though she still came out to the ranch several times a week. Lily stayed with Quincy and Tabitha, now a young woman of 13 who helped out with Thomas and around the ranch. When Thomas was 2 years old, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter Elizabeth arrived on a snowy December day. She was smaller than Thomas had been, but just as healthy, with Tabitha's green eyes and Quincy's stubborn chin. "We have a son and a daughter," Quincy marveled as he held Elizabeth for the first time. "Our family is complete." "It is," Tabitha agreed. She looked around the room at her husband, her children, at Lily, who was cooing over her new baby cousin, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "I have everything I ever wanted and so much more than I ever dreamed." The years passed quickly after that. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and followed Quincy everywhere, learning everything he could about cattle and horses. Elizabeth was more adventurous, always getting into things she shouldn't, keeping Tabitha on her toes. Lily grew into a beautiful young woman and eventually married a young lawyer from Denver, though she visited the ranch often. Margaret's husband passed away after 5 years of marriage, and she came back to live at the ranch, saying she'd miss the peace and quiet. She helped Tabitha with the children and the household, and the 2 women remained close friends. On a summer evening when Thomas was 8 and Elizabeth was 6, Tabitha and Quincy sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Elizabeth how to lasso fence posts, and she was laughing every time she missed. "You remember the night we met?" Quincy asked, his arm around Tabitha's shoulders. "Of course," Tabitha said. "I remember thinking I was going to die in that storm. I remember you refusing to let that happen. I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I'd ever met," Quincy said with a laugh. "You could barely stand, but you were still trying to send me away." "I was scared," Tabitha admitted. "I had learned not to trust kindness because it usually came with a price. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that some people are good just because that is who they are." "You saved me too, you know," Quincy said seriously. "I was lonely before you came along. I had my ranch and my work, but I did not have a home. You gave me that. You gave me everything." Tabitha turned to kiss him, still feeling that flutter in her stomach that she'd felt the first time their lips met. "I love you, Quincy Callahan. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "And I love you, Tabitha Callahan," Quincy replied. "Thank you for not giving up in that storm. Thank you for letting me find you." "Mama, Papa, look!" Elizabeth shouted, successfully lassoing a post. Thomas was applauding and both children were grinning with pride. "We see you, sweetheart," Tabitha called back. That was wonderful. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Tabitha reflected on how far she'd come. She'd traveled from Kansas to Colorado with nothing but the clothes on her back and 47 cents to her name. She'd nearly died in a blizzard, been rescued by a stranger who became the love of her life, and built a family and a home that was more than she'd ever imagined possible. The winter had driven her to seek a stranger's kindness, and that cowboy had become the home she'd always needed. Not just a physical home, though the ranch was certainly that, but an emotional home as well. A place where she was loved and valued, where she belonged without question, where she could finally be herself without fear. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving to have his father's way with cattle and his mother's head for business. At 20, he married a school teacher named Sarah, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property. Elizabeth was more restless, inheriting her parents' adventurous spirits. She went to Denver to study nursing, determined to help people the way the doctor had helped bring her into the world. She eventually married a doctor and opened a clinic that served the miners and their families, often providing care whether they could pay or not. Margaret lived to see all her grandnieces and nephews grow up, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Her daughter, Lily, inherited her mother's skill with numbers and became a bookkeeper for several businesses in Denver, always making time to visit the ranch where she'd grown up. Quincy and Tabitha celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, ranch hands past and present, and friends from all over Colorado. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the area, but more importantly, it had become known as a place where anyone could find help if they needed it. Quincy and Tabitha had made it a policy to hire people who were down on their luck, giving them the same chance Quincy had given Tabitha all those years ago. "We have built a good life," Quincy said that night after all the guests had left and they were alone in their bedroom. "We have," Tabitha agreed, settling into his arms with the ease of 3 decades of practice. She looked at her husband, his hair now more silver than dark, his face lined with years of sun and laughter. He was still the handsomest man she'd ever seen. "I still think about that night sometimes." "The night you found me." "So do I," Quincy admitted. I think about how easily I could have missed you. I almost stayed in the cabin that night instead of making one more pass through town. If I had, you would have frozen to death, and I never would have known what I'd missed." "But you didn't miss me," Tabitha said firmly. "You found me, and you saved me, and you gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. You gave me love and family and purpose. You gave me everything." "We gave it to each other," Quincy corrected gently. "I was just existing before you, Tabitha. Going through the motions. You taught me how to really live. You taught me that taking a risk on someone, opening your heart even when it is scary, that is where the real reward lies." As they lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, Tabitha felt profound gratitude. Not just for the big things, but for the small moments too. For 30 years of mornings waking up next to the man she loved. For thousands of cups of coffee shared in the kitchen while they planned their day. For the laughter of their children and grandchildren filling the house. For the satisfaction of hard work done well. For the simple comfort of a hand to hold. The winter storm that had nearly killed her had instead led her to everything she'd ever wanted. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives, she reflected, are actually the doorways to the best moments. We just have to be brave enough to walk through them. When Tabitha passed away at the age of 78, it was quietly in her sleep with Quincy beside her, just as she'd always wanted. She'd lived a full life, rich with love and laughter and purpose. Her last thought before sleep took her was of that snowy December night so many years ago, and the cowboy with kind eyes who'd refused to let her give up. Quincy followed her 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but everyone who knew him said he'd died of a broken heart, unable to live without the woman who'd been his partner for more than half a century. Thomas found him in the rocking chair on the porch, a peaceful smile on his face, looking out at the mountains he'd loved so much. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large pine tree. The headstones were simple, just their names and dates, but beneath Tabitha's name, Thomas had added an inscription. The winter made her seek a stranger's kindness. The cowboy became the home she'd always needed. The ranch stayed in the family for generations. Each Callahan descendant hearing the story of how their great-great-grandmother had nearly frozen to death in a blizzard and been saved by their great-great-grandfather's kindness. It became a family legend, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. The cabin in town where Quincy had first taken Tabitha eventually became a historic landmark, preserved as a reminder of Cripple Creek's early days. Tour guides would tell the story of the cowboy and the woman in the storm, though over the years the details got embellished and changed. But the heart of the story remained true. A woman alone and desperate, a man willing to help, and the love that grew between them that lasted a lifetime. Thomas ensured that his parents' legacy of helping others continued. The ranch maintained the policy of hiring people who needed a second chance, and the Callahan family became known throughout Colorado for their generosity and fairness. Several scholarships were established in Quincy and Tabitha's names, helping young people from difficult circumstances get an education. Elizabeth's clinic in Denver expanded over the years, eventually becoming a small hospital that served the working poor. She named it Everett Medical Center, after her mother's maiden name, and made sure that no one was ever turned away for lack of funds. She told all her patients about her mother, who'd been alone and desperate once, and how one act of kindness had changed everything. The story of Quincy and Tabitha became more than just a family legend. It became a parable about the power of kindness, about taking chances on people, about love that endures even the harshest conditions. It reminded people that everyone has a story, that the person you pass on the street might be fighting a battle you know nothing about, and that extending a hand to help could change not just their life but yours as well. On cold December nights in Cripple Creek, old-timers would sometimes tell the story to newcomers, embellishing certain details, but always ending the same way. And that's why you never leave someone out in the cold. You never know when you might be entertaining angels unaware, or when the person you save might end up saving you right back. The ranch house still stood a century and a half later, carefully maintained by descendants who understood its historical significance. Visitors could tour the property and see the bedroom where Tabitha had given birth to her children, the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, the porch where she and Quincy had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. But more importantly, they could feel the love that had soaked into the very walls of the place, the tangible legacy of two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. In the end, Tabitha and Quincy's story was both extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary because their meeting had been so improbable, because they'd overcome so much, because their love had been so deep and true. But ordinary because it was ultimately a story about two people who'd found each other and chosen to build a life together, day by day, year by year, through good times and bad. It was a story about how home isn't always a place you're born into, but sometimes a place you have to find, or that finds you. About how family isn't always blood, but sometimes the people who choose to love you when they don't have to. About how the worst storm of your life might be the thing that drives you to shelter in the arms of the person you were meant to find all along. And it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that kindness matters, that taking a chance on someone matters, that love matters. That even when you feel most alone, most hopeless, most certain that things will never get better, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to extend a hand. One person willing to see you not as you are in your worst moment, but as you could be if given a chance. The winter had made Tabitha seek a stranger's kindness. The cowboy had become the home she'd always needed. And together, they'd built something that lasted long after they were gone, a legacy of love and kindness that rippled out through generations, touching countless lives in ways they never could have imagined that snowy December night when their story began.